Good morning and welcome back to our fourth Acknowledging and Confronting Our History session. I'm Chris Faison and I'll be facilitating our conversation today. And we will be covering, share. We'll be covering the modern civil rights movement today. And we will build on our initial definitions of individual, interpersonal, and institutional racism with a new one. So today we'll look at structural racism, and this is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. And these systems give privileges to white people, resulting in disadvantages to people of color. So we will come back to this definition to start our conversation. So our first question. So in June of 1951, four Black law students desegregated the university. Where do you think our community is with respect to racial integration today? And so to backfill some information for this question, we're going to juxtapose desegregation versus integration. So in October of 1949, Harold Epps and other law students at North Carolina College in Durham, which is today's North Carolina Central University, filed a lawsuit seeking admission to UNC Law. The landmark Supreme Court case, Sweat versus Painter, was decided several months later on June 5th, 1950, and the court held that the Equal Protection Clause required that Sweat be admitted to the university, and this was at Texas at Austin. Locally, there was a federal district middle court that heard the case with the law students in Durham in August of 1950, and Thurgood Marshall represented the plaintiffs, who goes on, of course, to be a Supreme Court justice. And then a few months later, in October of 1950, the federal district court rules against the students. However, it was appealed up, and in March of 1951, the Fourth Circuit of the Court of Appeals favored the plaintiffs in the court case McKissick versus Carmichael. So that was actually the case that led to the desegregation, as opposed to, even though Sweat was a precedent that definitely put pressure on lots of parts of the country, including ours. UNC appealed that decision to the Supreme Court, and on June the 4th, 1951, the Supreme Court denied the request to hear the case. So one of the ways that UNC dealt with that as it admitted these students later that month was it committed itself to a policy of promoting programs that duplicated UNC graduate programs at North Carolina College in Durham to limit desegregation. So that was a strategy to try to lessen the number of students that would come. And then a few years later, the first Black undergraduates came in 1955 after the Brown decision the year before, and the university enforced segregation in many non-academic areas of university life, which made it really tough for those initial students. In 1954, as all of this is happening, Genevieve Lowry Cole gets a degree in medical technology, and she's our first Indigenous woman graduate. And she was born and raised as a member of the Lumbee tribe in Pembroke. So that was also happening at the same time. So she was able to get in a little bit before the case that led to undergraduates coming. So wanted to lift her up. She's actually still living today and very active with the community, with the American Indian Center. So question 2, Black representation in faculty and athletics on campus both began in 1966. How were systems of racial bias across institutions in Chapel Hill affected by these changes? So with this question, again, this is something that I knew vaguely, but I really was able to put it together when I was starting to do research a year ago for some trainings. And so 1966 had a few noteworthy events. In March of that year was the controversial speaker ban. And then later, Hortense McClinton becomes the first Black faculty member in the School of Social Work. She's also still living. She's a centenarian, and we're really glad to still have her. And then later in that same year, Charlie Scott signs his letter of intent. Now, he doesn't actually show up until the next year, but he was basically, we knew he was coming, in 66. So that was a very pivotal year for the local community. And he grows up in Harlem, as some of you may know. He attends Laurinburg Institute and graduated valedictorian, which is a fact that a lot of people tend to lose in all of the hype about him coming to Chapel Hill. But in looking back, he says a quote that I think is very appropriate for us to think about in our conversation later. And he says that at that time, no matter how comfortable I felt with my teammates, they still had to deal with the fact that they had never been around Black people either. I still couldn't go anywhere with their friends because their friends were still brought up in a South that was very separate. There was a lot of loneliness on my part, and a lot of times I questioned myself why I was here. So I think that's a good quote to help us consider. Although it was great what happened with Dean Smith being a forerunner of a lot of other teams, this was a real emotion that a current student had back in that time period in the mid '60s, mid to late '60s. And so this representation of Black faculty and scholarship athletes um, happening basically at the same time foreshadows the struggle to balance both academics and athletics, and it leads to and it helps explain the historical context for the situation that unfolds in 2010 with the major scandal that comes out. And then also I wanted to mention in 1967, Ricky Lanier was the first Black football scholarship athlete. And then 2 years later, Blyden Jackson joins the English department and becomes the first tenured Black professor. So those are a couple other points to be considered when we think about this question later. And then the third question, the 1970 murder of James Cates in the pit at Carolina is a local tragedy that directly links to our current, quote, third Reconstruction, and I'll come back to that term later. What privileges came from obscuring this blight on our local racial history? So I wanted to start with a local leader and friend, Anita Mason Hogans. She draws a striking parallel to this situation that a lot of people are still learning about by basically calling James Cates the Emmett Till of Chapel Hill in lots of ways. So on November 21st of 1970, there was a Black student group that was holding an all-night dance to foster race relations. They relied on non-students to increase diversity, primarily from Northside. Northside young people came to campus, even though even though they knew there was some risk involved with coming to campus. A biker gang named the Stormtroopers came to that dance, unfortunately, not for the same reasons as many of the people that were there. And around 2 a.m., some fights began outside. A biker was injured, and some of the Black young men who was involved in that, they ended up leaving. But there lots of other fights basically spawned from that. It's believed that James wandered outside, unaware of what was really happening, and he was stabbed by a biker gang member. 10 officers from UNC and the town responded, and an ambulance was called around 2:11 a.m. Police told stormtroopers to leave the scene, and a hospital was close by, as we know from the pit to where UNC Hospital is today. And finally, one police officer put him in the back of his car and took him to the ER. Witnesses say that police seemed unconcerned. They weren't tending to protecting or helping him. And the death certificate time of death was 3:30 a.m. The ER doctor mentions that the injuries did not have to be fatal. He could have saved James Cates' life if he had gotten there sooner. When a DTH photographer was called to the scene and he arrived, he took a photo of employees using water and a broom to wash blood from the bricks and down a storm drain. People thought that the victim or the alleged assailants weren't UNC students, so this has nothing to do with us. Ironically, Charlie Scott, who we mentioned earlier, was drafted just months earlier into the NBA. So another African American man about the same age in our community. And I also wanted to thank Mike Ogle, who's really done the research for a lot of this. And there's a podcast that should be available on, I think, the Chapel Hill History website. That's definitely through the Center for American South, and I'll give you all that later. But I also wanted to thank a faculty member who taught me a lot about this time period, Perry Hall. He's a former African American and diaspora studies faculty who sadly just passed away in mid-April. And he made clear to me and other students that there were schools of thought in Black studies. There's an integrationist / inclusionist stream, an Afrocentrism stream, and a cultural studies stream. So those are some things that are good to know as we think about this time period. So coming back again to our key terms, so structural racism is defined as the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. And these systems give privileges to white people, resulting in disadvantages to people of color. So I'd love to hear you all's thoughts about this definition, especially as it relates to the former definitions that we've already been discussing.
I'll kick us off here just a little bit, and this is less a comment about the definition, which seems right to me. Based on the ways this has been defined in the past. I was sent a video over the weekend that suggested that this definition or definitions like it are actually disempowering to Black Americans, and that that it is a project of progressives in our society to create definitions like this, or to talk about social constructs like this, that actually disempower African Americans rather than empowering them. And I thought, how very interesting. We're still today, after all the recent events, pushing back and against this very kind of definition.
Yeah, it seems to be such a push towards individualism that we can't quite shake, whether it relates to racism or mask wearing or lots of other things where we started there in these conversations, but the move to structural, it feels like where the history that's being taught and passed on, especially in white circles, these are the parts that aren't discussed, aren't taught, aren't gone into detail. And so we just get the individual aspects of it, and then we assume, oh, well, then the solution must be an individual one where I'll just not have negative thoughts towards people of color. At least that's the sort of situation that I grew up in the last 30 years.
Justin, I didn't understand why the definition is, I think you said disempowering.
Yeah. So the video, and I'm trying to recall the exact words. There's a brief 5-minute video. It basically suggested that that focusing on things like white privilege, or focusing on how structures oppress, the net result is that Black Americans are handicapped to essentially pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, to use their own agency to progress forward in society. And so my take was, what they're basically saying is that all this talk of structural racism, or racism in this kind of way, is a crutch that progressives use or that perhaps even the African American community uses to remain in places of oppression or marginalization. That was the insinuation of the video.
And when you say progressives, you mean specifically white progressives or white liberals?
I think that in the video, Democrats and intellectuals were called out specifically, and people of a more liberal or progressive mindset in that kind of way. And this is really political progressives, in that way.
I just took the definition to be neutral, a description of something, which is why when Chris asked, what do you think of the definition? I thought, well, I don't think anything of it. It's describing something that needs to change.
I'm afraid I don't understand the distinction between structural racism and institutional racism, which we've had last week. And so I would love some clarification about that. And I'm feeling challenged by Justin's comments and trying to sort through that. As a Democrat, progressive, liberal, white woman, I find the definitions helpful, but they're not an ending point at all. And if they are unhelpful, I want to understand that better as well. But first, if you could help distinguish between the institutional racism and the structural racism, the definition of that includes institutions, I would love to understand better.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, because that's part of the reason I wanted to go through each of them, week by week, so that we can have time to process them. And so basically, like last week, institution is about an organization. It can be a small organization. Usually we refer to larger, more elaborate organizations when we think about it. And then structural is several institutions, or really many institutions across society. So you could use, a major bank, or, the hospital or something as an example, but then structural would be like several of those in our community in particular, and how it looks across a few organizations. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like, we throw systemic in there too, and I didn't necessarily use that one because I think the definitions that I got from the National Museum on African American History and Culture uses these four. But I think that we also can recognize, and I'd love to hear some of y'all's thoughts about this, about how it can also be in a smaller setting of institutions. It doesn't necessarily have to be across the entire nation or a large swath of it. It's lots of times structural, it interplays with all those others in lots of fun ways, or I shouldn't say fun, but interesting ways to create advantage and disadvantage. So I appreciate your question. I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts about institutional versus structural in their own example, in their own lives, or what they know.
Well, it seems like institutional racism can be addressed by policy changes or rule changes within a specific institution, provided that the rule changes or policy changes are enforced. But when I hear structural systemic racism, I hear the same thing, which is a mindset. And a mindset can't be legislated. So I know that gradualism can be sort of a crutch that kicks the can down the road. That's really kind of offensive. Gradualism can be offensive. But I think that some change, however offensive it may be, is going to come gradually. And that's mindset. Mindset can't be enforced. Individual people have to have experiences that change the way they see the world. Everybody has a worldview, but not everybody's conscious of their worldview. And so worldview has to change in the lives of individuals. I think that runs a parallel track with institution changes, and those can be dramatic and sudden. Legislation is passed, or within an institution, a rule is changed. But across institutions, across society, there has to be generational shifts that are hard to see in the moment. We may look back at this time and say, wow, that summer of 2020, when there were protests everywhere, resulted in changes across society, across a next generation's mindset. But we won't see it now. We won't see it until we look back on this.
I was struck upon hearing the stories that Chris was telling us about these various events in Chapel Hill, how unknown these are among people in Chapel Hill. And at the time they were happening, I suspect that most of the university community looked at this and said, well, what's the problem here? And you can see that by the university's legal actions in opposing some of these, callousness of dealing with someone with a mortal injury. And it makes me wonder what is happening today that many of us are asking, well, what's the problem? It wasn't a problem to the people living and making decisions then, and where we are today is not a problem for many of us. Structural racism, it seems to me, is often not obvious to most of us. Only in retrospect, it becomes clear to many of us that, yeah, this is a real problem. It was a real problem when the federal government redlined most of America and essentially chose to give wealth building mortgages to white Americans and build public housing for Black Americans. But at the time, it wasn't recognized as being structural racism. Now, with the distance of history, we can see that. But hopefully, with the wisdom of history, we can also see that there are similar structures today that are very opaque to us when looked at through our modern eyes.
Could I ask that in your incident with the gentleman, James Cates, you said it was a motorcycle gang called the Stormtroopers? Wasn't that a Black motorcycle gang out of Durham?
So from what I understand, they were a white gang that eventually come under the umbrella of Hell's Angels.
Okay.
So there could have been, it's possible there could have been one with a similar name in Durham for sure, but I'm not aware of that.
There was a motorcycle gang out of Durham at that time with a similar name. And so I would like to hear some clarification on that, because that could lead also into the callous nature of them dealing with that whole event in terms of, why get involved if it's similar to what we see now, the response of Black on Black crime. It's sort of a mindset that let them deal with it among themselves. They're animals anyway. So I just like to push the envelope in that direction, see from all spectrums, in terms of the response there. But dealing with the structural piece, just look at the name of structural racism. There's steps in it. There are levels of it. Some they call it the glass ceiling, but we can't even get into the door for the fact that there are the procedures that are built in to cut off and to limit accessibility to resources, to information. Listening to Wes speak about redlining, banks in itself, in terms of how this thing was, it didn't just happen overnight. This was intentional. And so that's what I look at in terms of the structure. How do we reinforce that which has benefited us? And there are structures to that, I believe, that leads to this question.
So I read this New York Times opinion piece yesterday. It was written by the former mayor of Minneapolis. And I wonder if this kind of gets at the difference between institutional and structural. And she talks about, there's a moment, during her time as mayor where police fatally shot a person of color, and there were, like an 18-day protest outside the police station. And she tells the story. Basically, her point is, it's one thing to critique the, you look at the police department, you say, that is an institution that has racial bias in it. And what she's trying to lift the gaze to see the structural realities, and because in her experience, it was, the kind of white liberal policies or unwillingness to deal with it is on the structural level. And she talks about during that 18-day protest around the precinct, how she was dealing with increasing frustration from the officers. And finally, because she was giving them orders, do not arrest anybody out there. If you start doing that, you're going to start a riot. And finally, one of the, I don't know, sergeants just kind of like chewed her out. And then she writes this. She says, the not fully said bottom line of his message was clear. White liberals like me asked the police to do our dirty work, dealing with the racial and economic inequities our policies create. Normally, we turn a blind eye to the harsh methods that many of them use to achieve our goal of order, pretend that isn't what we've done, and then act surprised when their tough guy behavior goes viral and gets renewed scrutiny. I don't know, that kind of was an interesting illustration of the difference between, like, you can look at a singular institution and say that's racist, but you got to step back enough to understand, okay, how have I enabled that? How have we enabled that through a failure of policy? I don't know if that's 2 cents, you think?
Before we move to another question, I did just want to briefly mention a book. So Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law is a great book to look at when you think about how I'm trying to see, I think the subtitle of the book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And so it's a very well reviewed a book that helps to really parse out how laws, have created some of these structures. So I'd commend it to everybody.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Justin. I've heard that book before, and I've heard a mentor just mention that a few days ago. And Jared, I think that piece you read mentioned is definitely part of what we're trying to figure out. And like, I like how Michael mentions about how this is intentional. And so, to even Lisa's point, part of the thing that I'm looking forward to seeing what we do once we get through this time is really start to think about, okay, how do you attack each of those issues? Like the next two principles will be more focused on kind of like, how do you undo it? Because it really takes, they were intentionally used in concert to create what we have. So we have to be able to do the same to uncreate what we have. And I think some of the questions and even comments like, Wes mentioned in redlining, like I love how all of this is, just coming together and helping people have an understanding of how we got here. And so one question that I'd love to, the first question, get your feedback on is, with respect to how 1951, and back to Rob's point about the laws piece, but we have this idea of de jure law by law, but then de facto is by custom. And so just because it's in law, as we will know, doesn't mean right now, like with, how people are responding to the pandemic, doesn't mean people are going to do it or that they're ready. So with the first 4 Black law students coming in 1951, which is pretty early in the long civil rights movement, where do you think our community is with respect to racial integration? Because desegregation and integration are not the same. And so I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about where we find ourselves in, the greater Chapel community, not just Chapel Durham. Like, we're not, we all kind of bleed into each other, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about where we are with respect to racial integration today.
Well, I'll try to quickly say that I don't give us very high marks, particularly as religious organizations. So when you look at the school district, so that's one thing that's observable here in our area. We're able to see some attempts at the schools to have some intermixing of students, some integrations of students, but that is hampered by the overall census and how it's more and more difficult for African Americans to live in Chapel Hill, for instance, things like that. I've got children in the school district, and whereas they observe other students of color, it doesn't feel like a critical mass in their schools. And so there's that. And then as it relates to religious institutions. You know, as a church on Franklin Street, it's interesting. Once, when I was an associate pastor here years ago, there was an African American teenager and his looked to be elementary school younger brother, and they were in the hall wandering around, and I happened to be wandering down the hall. And I said, "Hey guys, what's up?" You know, started creating some conversation, and the older of the two said, "We were on Franklin Street, and I just wanted to show my younger brother what a white church looked like inside." You know, just this assumption that, look, given the location, location matters in a town. Given the location, historically, this part of town has been for, you know, the thinking as whites and to some degree students who are on campus to some degree. I talked to a barber in town who's grown up here all his life, grew up in North Side. Must be in his later 60s. Couldn't identify where our church was. They'd grown up all. He said, "Look, you know, we grew up knowing that you were not supposed to go to Franklin Street. That's the white part of town. I mean, a stone's throw from where this barbershop is. So it's, and so to him." Today, that's still a reality. This is not a space to integrate. And whereas I think our religious institutions believe that we are open and inclusive in town and try to be, you know, there are storied, historied, and maybe even when you think about the architecture of communities, barriers to entry that we don't fully appreciate.
Yeah, I think we definitely have a long way to go toward integration. And this conversation, and Chris, the historical presentation has been very helpful. We started out with the founding of the town to the Civil War, and then Civil War to 1920s, and now to the Civil Rights Movement. So most of that history has been with the institutions of slavery, Jim Crow, and still communal segregation. And so historically, it's just a very recent, you know, opportunity or effort. And what I have observed is since the civil rights movement, there's increasing inclusion, but it's inclusion in institutions and structures whose foundations are structured for the benefit of white people for generations and generations. So there's inclusion without a creating of a new structure of society.
Integration for us in terms of the African American community, it's like asking to be let into a game that you know is already fixed. Um, what I mean by that is, in the process, inclusion cost us a great deal. Sacrificing businesses, ideals, thinking that what we wanted to get into to be included was better than what we had already created. And that's evident here in Chapel Hill, but it's not just Chapel Hill. That is pervasive. That is something that we have to deal with, getting to your point of desegregation. North Carolina College, which is really North Carolina Central, um, was, still is a good school, but it was painted to be inferior because we wanted to be a part of the larger school. Larger is not better. So in the process that we have lost ourselves in the fact that we had to give up so much to be included in this rigged game. We knew the game was rigged, but we wanted to get into it. And now the consequences that we see from it of creating self-doubt and yes, even our own self-hatred, of wanting to be like everyone else. Now to say to have dialogue is not bad. This is a wonderful thing. But in the process, let's respect both sides and understand that we didn't just come with nothing. We had to create from nothing. From the biblical perspective, we made bricks without straw. Um, so out here in Chapel Hill, getting to think about what Justin was saying about his church, university. Of course, that is a prominent place. It's on a hill. It's almost at the top of the hill, and that is significant of having the highest point. Wherever you went in the city, you could see it, and sort of a reminder. It's nice to be tolerated, but will we be really? Uh, will we be included? Will we be respected? Um, so those are just a few of my thoughts.
I really appreciate the distinction between desegregation and integration. And the question I've been asking myself and the people of the advocate community is, what desegregation to me suggests a breaking down as opposed to a moving forward. And I think we need to break down before we can move forward. And the question I keep asking myself and others is, what are we willing to give up in order to desegregate? What are we willing to give up to make change, as opposed to asking others to give things up, or asking others to compromise or change their culture? What are we willing to change of our advantage? There's a letter to the church that was written by 3 women clergy of color, written to the Episcopal Church. And one thing that they said that was helpful was that when we say that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, it doesn't mean a flipping of the hierarchy, but it really is the goal of, all on the same place together and the same plane together. And that requires change, and it requires those who have been up here to give up something. What are we willing to give up to make that happen? That's why Michael's comments, I'm sorry, that's why Michael's comments are so profound to me to think about, that there was so much that others had to give up in order, of their own, people of color had to give up their own culture and their own way of being and their own identity in order to try to move towards integration. I appreciate that, hearing that, as painful as it is.
So, siblings, and I'll also say that just as I encouraged a mindfulness about time, I'm just not being mindful. But there's been studies done about the integration of children in schools that say, particularly in the preschool level, that have been made aware of over the last year, that in preschools, it's advantageous for students of color to be in schools with a number of white students. And because it helps to accelerate the achievement of those students of color, but everybody all together. It's a very curious study. So what's it really saying? Is it saying that students of color, if they're in schools of where there's higher densities of students of color would not achieve well. Well, if they're not going to achieve well because and they're not able to achieve well because there are not a lot of white students around. So why is that? Are white students helping these students of color to achieve well, or is there something else? Is it about how those schools are resourced? Is it about the teachers that are able to be recruited to those schools or those school systems? I mean, what are the other factors? Because if we're saying that a student of color cannot achieve unless there's a white student sitting next to them, I think we have to examine the conditions for education that we have created rather than assuming that there is something deficient about a group of students of color learning together in a majority Black or in a mixed people of color environment. I mean, just it's things like this that continue to contribute, I think, to unhelpful integrations like Michael was referencing earlier.
And Justin, I appreciate that study because I think that links to the second question, and I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about, just the impact of having representation both at the faculty level and at the scholarship athlete level. So, like, with systems of racial bias across institutions in Chapel Hill, how do you think they were affected? In thinking about, with Justin's question with the younger children, but through university, particularly with, Charlie Scott, I think that's probably easier to see than maybe Hortense McClinton, but how were systems of racial bias across institutions of Chapel Hill impacted by or affected by, desegregation, again, not integration, in the mid 60s. And again, I really appreciate Michael's comments about, the things that people had to give up and was it worth it? So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about that in conjunction with Justin's point. And definitely some voices I haven't heard yet, if you'd be comfortable to, just to hear y'all's thoughts.
I'm going to tee us up a little bit. This is an indirect answer to your question, but it does seem to me that this is the time that we like to tell stories about here in Chapel Hill, because this is the time, particularly as you start having celebrated athletes being added to the athletics program. This begins, I think, the golden age of the Chapel Hill myth. We are a progressive, integrating, desegregating town that is yet another reminder of why we are the southern part of heaven, because we had courageous coaches and courageous leaders who looked at people in the town who held less than Chapel Hillian ideals and said, "You are wrong. This is who we are." And and so then, I mean, people of this age are spoken of like the gods of Mount Olympus in the ways that they have shaped a modern, progressive Southern town and institution, the University of North Carolina. It's profound and I think in so many ways untrue mythology.
Yeah, it makes me think about how I'm in Durham, and so in Durham, Michael's comment about what had to be given up for integration to happen. It was a one-way street. So it was the Black businesses that suffered. And, even, if we look at religious communities, it's like, well, predominantly white church would want people of color to come to us. It's never the other way around. And the busing that has happened historically in different parts of the country and these sorts of things, it seemed as though, to Lisa's question about what we haven't been willing to answer, what are we willing to give up for these sorts of integration to happen. You think about real estate is one of these examples. And I think that as a white person, some of the questions I have too is, well, but what are the ways, like around gentrification, so I can move into a neighborhood of color, let's say predominantly people of color, with others, and then that begins to push folks out, or I can just continue to keep the system propped up by just staying in predominantly white spaces. And I know we're not necessarily talking about solutions at this point, but I think that as we move closer to, modern day, we continue to see like how it's still been a one-way street, and it feels like we're still walking on a one-way street with it, with all of the resources and all that seems to flow in one direction.
But let me tell you a one-way street story that my wife educated me about. Rain grew up in Chapel Hill, and she was in Chapel Hill when there was the integration of the two high schools into one. Well, people thought, well, what should we name this high school? Well, of course, they chose the name of the white high school. Well, who should be the principal? Well, of course, the principal was the principal of the white high school. Well, who'll be the football coach? Well, of course, the football coach will be the coach from the formerly white high school. So it was all this giving up of the culture and the heritage of the historically Black high school to integrate within the white high school. And I thought that was a pretty compelling story.
Yeah, integration as assimilation. That's interesting.
I wanted to reference an older article by W.B. Du Bois that I would suggest for people who are interested in this idea. And it's right around the miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. I think it's like right after in 1935. And it's in the article is called "Does the Negro Need Separate Schools?" So without giving too much away, I think that would be interesting for people to check out at some point, because he's asking the question almost 100 years ago. And it feels like when I found it, when someone told me about it, I think, or when I stumbled upon it, I was like, wow, he's talking to us today. So, yeah, the idea of giving up, I think, is what to give up. And then, what does giving up mean? Like, I just love I love Justin talking about the golden age part. Like, so like, with respect to like, having one of the first Black scholarship athletes in the South, from what I understand, not the first, but one of the first. And I'll use this to kind of tie into the last question. Like, he's this gentleman who ends up becoming, respected because he helps us to win, right? But on the other hand, we have, right as he's being drafted, we have a local man who's basically murdered on campus. And the idea is, even though he wasn't a student, that's not our problem. So, what are some ways that we can try to like reconcile this? Like, if you have the same skin, you might even be this, well, Charlie Scott was tall, but you might be close to the same height or build, right? Like, but if you're helping, the town, really, like businesses, like, what did game day look like, prior to the time we're in now? Like, you're getting all of the stuff from this person that has a skin color, but then as soon as they, you know, or if they're not a recognized face and there's someone like a Cates, you know, you're viewed as inconsequential, or even sometimes, you know, you're a menace or we're afraid of you. So like, what are some ways that we can think about, and it might just be more questions like Kurt said, like, what are some questions that people have about how do we begin to think about ways to give up things, or to like to help rectify some of these situations, as Rob mentioned earlier with respect to policy. It's like also it's how do you help move people, but also policy.
Just to put this on a personal level, these conversations have been very helpful. So I've heard mention of the achievement gap in the schools, and also the differences in employment practices, hiring practices, interviewing practices, and how the differences are very real. But I also, I mean, it helps me to recognize that I can see that in my mind as being wrong, but I still personally feel some emotional distance from it. And I think that is a product of structural racism and what it means for me to be white in this society. And so, one thing that I need to give up is that luxury of distance, that to think that I can distance myself from the real struggles and frustrations and difficulties of my community.
I mean, in light of what I said last week about the advocate, and we were ready to build or do work on the site, and while we'd had a previous commitment to giving business to Black-owned businesses, we fell back on the default of what was most convenient and where the networks were that people we knew people. So one of the things to give up is convenience and willing and to take on a willingness to take more time or take a chance with someone you don't know or whatever. You know, that's a very clear example to me.
Man, I think for me, like my former call, I was shaped a bit by community organizing, and the disciplines there were frankly, like, or the underpinnings were that people will fundamentally operate in their own self-interest. Like, that's just a given about people. Now, that fit in snugly with my theology. I'm a Calvinist, you know, hey, Rob, I know you love that. But then the goal, and what I struggle with here, and part of this is just very specific to me as a new guy who had 6 months to get to know his church before COVID came down. You know, the discipline in community organizing is a lot of relational meetings, because when you get to know people, you get to know their self-interest, you get to care about them, it expands your self-interest. And what I'm aware of is I am woefully, I am out of touch with what people of color in our community are, what's in their immediate self-interest. And I don't know them. I don't know community individuals well enough to have expanded my self-interest to take their self-interest in. So I feel like that's like where I am right now, just like speaking honestly about how I feel a little hampered right now about not knowing what to do on the policy front, because I haven't sat down and talked with people enough to understand what is it. The achievement gap, is it something else, you know, is it like, because I mean, my experience, white people run away with what they think the problem is, and then of course the solution, without really talking to anybody.
I guess it's time for confession. I was just sitting here thinking, and I listened to Michael about giving up some things. And giving up some things and being in a majority white denomination in the United Methodist Church, I gave up things and didn't even realize it really until much later. And I really kind of regret that. But I was seeking some kind of reconciliation, some kind of movement forward, some kind of justice, some kind of place where we didn't see skin color as a sin, as being not sacred, not having the breath of God, not having the same sacredness and personhood. So I really regret that. And I had to do it over. And having the knowledge I have now, I probably wouldn't have given up some of those things. But I was hoping to draw the other side closer to middle ground. And maybe that's a weakness on my part. I saw Christ Jesus as too weak of a God man. I think much later I began to read scripture thinking this one that has come to us in human flesh wasn't weak at all. But it was interpreted to me like that. And I think my early years in the church, I sort of got that education that, it'll be better in the by and by. Don't worry so much about how things are now, then God will take care of it, and that we'll have a better life, a life full of justice and love and equality when we get to heaven. And that's not true. It is supposed to be done here and now. And the prayer is, let it be so on earth as it is in heaven. And let it be so now.
Amen.
Amen. Chris, if I could, I just, I'd heard about, read something about James Cates here over the last week, and I can't even remember why the article came in front of me, but just this sense that this young man bleeding out in the pit could have been saved. What I read before was that the officers allowed him to remain there for a while, and it's just the again the time, the delay, and so it's lamentable, and certainly we lament everyone who has literally been allowed to die in the streets because of too much time, too much neglect, too much pressure of whatever sort being given. Also wonder about the ways that we, so I begin, especially as we talk about integration, desegregation, I grow more and more impatient as we've talked about schools. I'll continue to come back to it. I mean, as we see gaps persist, it's like year after year we allow students to academically bleed out. And where's the urgency? I mean, so some of what as we talk about structural racism, some of the question is, in what ways are we overly gradualist, or in what ways do we have such a lack of urgency where we talk about, well, this boy, folks are bleeding out there, but aren't quick to put them in an ambulance, aren't quick to uh, to give them the attention that they need for flourishing. And that's one of the things that continues to concern me, because every time an academic year goes by, as we think about those inequities, there are students who are lost to the fate of so many students in Chapel Hill. But we could talk about that related to so many kinds of institutions, so many kinds of structures, and in what ways do we either figuratively or literally allow folks to bleed out?
And Justin, that was a great kind of image of like one of the things we talked about and how it's persists today. And so I wanted to mention that for our next time together, we'll be looking at the 80s and the 90s. And one of the topics I'm going to focus on is the genesis of how the school system and the community starts to reconcile it. So this idea of the achievement gap and when that kind of becomes hot. So I look forward to us engaging more recent times and continuing to stir questions, and and then, as I said, as we get toward the end, really working together as a group to figure out how to actually do things on all the levels as a group, which will be stronger together than trying to do it individually. So yeah, thank y'all so much for your time.
Thank you.